Yeah, this is
Last one, that was.
Oh, we said that. We like.
Oh, okay, well, that's something I'm very good at. Up here.
That girl. Yep.
Over to you. Oh, we're ready to go.
Are you ready to go?
So as ready as I will be.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Eli, and I am hosting this event on behalf of McNally Robinson Booksellers here in Saskatoon. Tonight's event is coming to you, not from on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. A special hello to anyone who is joining us through the live stream from home, and for those of you who are here in person, thank you for joining us as well. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Critical Reflections on Teacher Education: Why Future Teachers Need Educational Philosophy by Howard Woodhouse. Thank you, Howard, for being here this evening and for the event as well. I'd also like to thank Routledge for working with us to create this event. Howard Woodhouse is Professor Emeritus and co-director of the Saskatchewan Process Philosophy Research Unit in the Department of Educational Foundations here at the University of Saskatchewan. What a title. He is the author of more than 80 book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals, and his Selling Out to Academic Freedom and the Corporate Market has been was shortlisted for a Saskatchewan Book Award. And we'll now hear from Howard, followed by a brief Q&A and a book signing as well at the table in the back. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to repeat and acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 land, and the homeland of the various groups that you mentioned, First Nations that you mentioned, and homeland to the Métis people. So I want to thank you all for coming. Most of you actually I know, but thank you for those of you I don't know for coming. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Eli, for organizing this event, which was, because you're not the usual organizer, and you filled in very well. So thank you very much. I must say that I noticed that Mary Walsh is coming to Saskatoon on Sunday, and I can assure you that there will be more laughs in her show than in this one. Okay, so be warned. It's not really a laughing matter, unfortunately, what I'm going to talk about. And I also should say that I have what's called an essential tremor, which was triggered by the 3 years that I spent teaching at a university in Africa. So if you see me tremoring, that's okay. That's normal for me. So don't worry about it. Now, unlike most authors who come here, I'm not going to read from my book. I'm actually going to talk about my book, so that you get the gist. Hopefully you get the gist of what the book is about. And so if you don't get the gist, you have every right at the end to ask questions, even difficult questions, because I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions after I finish what I'm going to say. Now, the book is actually dedicated to my parents, who are no longer with us, because without them, none of this could have happened. But more especially, and more particularly, I want to thank Viola, who is my lifelong partner, without whose loving support, this book would have not seen the light of day, because through conversations throughout the couple of years that it took, She was always there for me, so I want to thank her. So I'll start off by saying, or asking the question, why did I write this book, right? Well, it was a COVID project, but it was actually much more than that. Because having spent 5 decades involved in teacher education, I thought that maybe I might have something worthwhile saying. At least I hoped that I would have something worthwhile to say about teacher education. Especially about the importance of philosophy in educating future teachers, and more specifically about how educational philosophy can improve the quality of teacher education. And then, in fact, by implication, how educational philosophy can help to improve the classroom practice of teachers. Now, my aim at least, was to do this in a fairly accessible way. But I just reread the whole book, and I have to admit, holy cow, Howard, some of this is not like falling off a log, right? Some of this is actually quite complicated. But I did at least strive to present the main ideas of the book in a fairly accessible way. And the way I did that was by using narratives based on my own personal and professional experience to introduce each chapter. So to underline the themes of each chapter. But I also used what I hope is reasoned argument throughout. And I have to say also that this question that I'm addressing about the importance of educational philosophy is actually quite an urgent question for the following reason, that I could just give you 2 examples. In the Department of Educational Foundation, when I first joined that excellent department, just over 30 years ago, there were actually 5 of us teaching educational philosophy, one of whom is delighted to see here tonight, Don Cochran. There were 5 of us teaching educational philosophy at that time. For the last 3 years since I retired, there are none. There are none. And if we look at Canada in general, recent research shows that actually in teacher education programs across Canada, less than 10% have required courses in philosophy of education, mandated courses. So this is a big problem. It's a big problem, right? So let me start with talking about the title of the book. Here it is. Is it? Critical Reflections on Teacher Education, Why Future Teachers Need Educational Philosophy. Now that's quite a mouthful, right? It's not the most catchy of titles. So I want to try and initially try to break it down for you to try to analyze what it means. So let's start with reflections. Now, reflections, I think to reflect is a process that involves taking time to step back and think carefully about any subject matter. It could be to think about what one does in one's life, or it could be what one teaches, but it's a process of stepping back and thinking, taking time to think about any subject matter, in this case about education and teacher education. Reflections is the next one. I've said that. Reflections become critical reflection when they reveal what is problematic in a text or in reality that calls for revision in one's thought or action. So critical reflection to actually reveal what's problematical either in reality or in a text that calls for revision of one's ideas or one's action. Teacher education. What's teacher education? Well, teacher education is a process of educating, and educating comes from the Latin word educare, meaning to cause or enable to grow. Education is a process of causing or enabling one's students, or indeed oneself, to grow. And yet, and teacher education involves that process that enables young people who have chosen to instruct students formally in schools or in other places of learning, like the workplace, for example. Now, these future teachers, I argue, need, that's the next thing in the title, they need educational philosophy in the following sense: that without it, the value of their professional lives is impoverished or becomes less valuable. In other words, they need educational philosophy in order to fulfill the full value of their professional lives. Now, philosophy has a reputation, as I'm sure most people here would agree, has a reputation as a rather esoteric discipline. But it actually involves asking questions that have a direct bearing on how we can live or teach or learn. Actually, it asks questions about how we should live or teach or learn, because philosophy has always been motivated by asking the question, what is good, what is bad, what is justice, what is knowledge? Those fundamental questions. And that's because philosophy itself is an activity of critical reflection, in just the sense I said. Critical reflection. It's looking at problems that need revision in thought or action. And we know from strong experience and evidence, which I can come to later in the question period, we know that children readily engage in posing such questions. Who am I? Is there a God? What is time? All these kinds of questions children have the natural propensity to ask, and we adults don't do a very good job of encouraging those questions. In fact, we tend to stifle them because, oh my goodness, stop asking all these difficult questions, right? Why this, how that, right? We don't do a very good job of encouraging that natural propensity in children to ask those philosophical questions. All right, so much for the title. So what then does the book actually say? You might ask, what does it actually say? Like, come on, Woodhouse, tell us, right? Well, in general, I argue that teacher education in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom would be a lot better if philosophy regained its central position, along with other foundational disciplines like history, sociology, and anthropology of education. Now, until quite recently, all of these disciplines were considered important. That's why they were called foundational disciplines. So what happened? What happened? What happened? There are so few people teaching it here. Why are there not so few mandatory courses across Canada in philosophy of education? Now, I concentrate on philosophy because that's my shtick, right? But the same questions can be asked about the other disciplines that I've mentioned. So, in the first chapter, I argue that the demise of educational philosophy is linked to the rise of the market model. The market model is so called because it considers the goal of education and the goal of the market to be the same. But I argue that this is a fatal mistake. Fatal mistake. Because the goal of education is to create and pass on knowledge that's shared with others. You share knowledge with others. But the goal of the market is to maximize private money profits. That's the goal of the market, to maximize private money profits. Now, the two goals are not only different, but they're actually contradictory. Why? Because whereas the purpose of education is to share ideas among those engaged in the process of inquiry, the overriding goal of the market is to make ever more money for private individuals and corporations. So you see that knowledge, the goal of education in sharing knowledge, knowledge becomes stronger the more it's shared. Why? Because more people can pose questions, critical questions of any knowledge claim if they're engaged in the process of inquiry. That's on the one hand, that's education, that's the goal of education. The goal of the market is quite different. The goal of the market is to create ever more gain for oneself so that excludes other people from having access to that money. Because the whole purpose of the market is to make more money for private individuals and private corporations. So they're opposed. The problem is that government officials, university administrators, school boards, corporate representatives, and I even have to say some faculty, overlook this contradiction. They all repeat the same mantra that education and teacher education, and I quote, must make Canadian workers more competitive in the global economy. That becomes the aim of education, not knowledge or truth, or sharing knowledge or creating knowledge or truth, but making workers more competitive in the global economy. There are some variations of that, which you may have heard, but basically the same mantra. Now, the result is that teacher education, in particular, dispensing with those foundational disciplines deemed to have no real, that is to say, market value. And this turns teachers, I argue in the book, into technicians whose professional capacity to make qualified and informed judgment about what and how they teach is reduced. Both that capacity to make qualified and informed judgment is reduced. And they have less and less time to address the learning needs and capacities of their students. So that's all there in chapter 1. Well, there's more in chapter 1 than that, but that's the gist, I would say. So having critiqued the current state of teacher education, the rest of the book argues for its reconstruction on the basis of several key concepts. So it's like a dialectic, critique and then reconstruction. Together these concepts comprise a philosophical framework capable of articulating a robust climate change teacher education. Now, this is a big claim. It's a big claim, right? And it's one that I make in a non-dogmatic way that is open to question. In other words, if there is not sufficient evidence supporting this claim, then it has to be revised. And I'm quite willing to do that. And I hope you'll ask me about some of these concepts, because I'm making a big claim. I mean, if you're going to go for it, go for the full 9 yards, right? You know, not bother with dribbling around. Now, I also argue that Indigenous knowledge systems have an important place in any such framework of climate change teacher education. I just want to mention two off the bat, and at least one more later. The first one I want to mention is what's called two-eyed seeing. Now, two-eyed seeing has been advocated by several Indigenous authors. And two-eyed seeing provides a lens through which both Indigenous and Western forms of knowledge are valued. And they can work together to provide a critical understanding of dominant value systems and dominant knowledge in any field. But in my case, what I'm arguing is that they can help to provide a critical understanding of the dominant value systems that are preventing and hindering climate change teacher education. That's the first concept. The second concept from Indigenous knowledge system is Indigenous storytelling, or Indigenous storytelling. Now, this is a way of knowing that emphasizes relationships with the land and all living creatures. The relationships with the land and all living creatures, with one's ancestors and one's kinship groups, and the languages and the oral traditions of Indigenous language. So in other words, land-based education is much more than just outdoor education. It's regarding the land as the source of all value, as a source of all life, and the source of Indigenous cultures as well. It's integrated with the history and cultures of Indigenous people. Now, as a non-Indigenous author, I'm also aware that Western philosophical tradition, the Western philosophical tradition or tradition, have tended to subordinate all other philosophical systems. We tended to do that in the West. And since most of the philosophical concepts that I use in this book are from the Western tradition, I have approached this question of knowledge, what is known as epistemological question of the theory of knowledge. I approach it with caution throughout the book. And yeah, I do, both at the beginning of the book and in the final chapter. And in some ways, it's not resolved. It's not fully resolved. Okay, I'll be the first to admit that. So the first of these concepts from Western philosophy that is central to my account of climate change teacher education is taken from the philosophy of Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, British mathematician, logician, and writer on many social questions and advocate of peace, who went to jail twice in his lifetime because of his advocacy of peace. Now, Russell wrote a book in 1916, long time ago, 1916, called Principles of Social Reconstruction. It was written during the First World War. And in that book, he argues that for the growing principle of life, the growing principle of life that animates the whole of nature, and that it's sacred, and it's especially prominent in children. Now, only where educators recognize this principle, the growing principle of life, and have what he calls reverence for its presence in each child, can the process of growth at the core of education take place. So without reverence for the growing principle of life, the process of growth that is education can't take place. And moreover, that their sense of caring, the sense of caring of each child for humanity and for a sense of balance with nature, that cannot happen without this reverence for the growing principle of love. To be successful, teacher education, he argues, must be founded on the same respect for the planet as supporting all of life. And Russell argued that future teachers should have the courage to express their views based on evidence and reason, the wisdom to know how to do so, coupled with a tentative approach to the knowledge they pass on to their students. So all knowledge is tentative in the sense that it can be revised in the light of new evidence and good reason. So that's the first key concept that I use, the growing principle of life. Second, the worldwide movement of philosophy for children provides two further concepts for a robust climate change teacher education. The first of these is what's called a community of inquiry, a community of inquiry. And a community of inquiry is one that enables children as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, to engage in respectful and critical dialogue about logical and ethical questions, guided by teachers who have learned the art of philosophical discussion through ongoing practice. So they're learning to engage in important questions that fire their imagination, and I'll come back to how this works a bit later, in ways that are respectful of people, other students, other children who have different views. And then they learn how to discuss these questions in a reasonable way. And these are often ethical questions, moral questions. Now, this process is facilitated when children engage in storytelling. Storytelling, making stories about themselves, and also reading stories that stimulate their imagination and their capacity for reason. Okay, so these stories stimulate both their imagination and their capacity for reason. Now, Matthew Libman and Anne Margaret Sharp, who were founders of Philosophy of Children, and who I was fortunate enough to meet many years ago at a conference in the States, both wrote novels that have been used with children for this purpose. They both wrote novels like this. And if you have a question about this, I can read you a little excerpt from one. Quite funny, actually. And both these people, Lippmann and Sharp, were actively involved in developing the capacity of teachers to use storytelling in communities of inquiry. So they use this in not only for children in classrooms, but they use this in educating teachers who themselves would then become competent to do so. So those are the second set of concepts, community of inquiry and storytelling. Now, to complement Russell's growing principle of life, which I talked about, the concept of life value, articulated by Canadian philosopher John McMurtry, is also part of, it's integral to my account of climate change teacher education. So what on earth is life value? Well, life value is actually quite a simple concept. Life value, he argues, stems from the capacity of the earth to support and reproduce life by promoting greater diversity among all species without endangering any of them. So life value stems from the earth itself because it supports diversity of all species, not just humankind, but all species, without endangering any of them. This capacity, which constitutes what he calls the life ground of value, produces such goods as clean air, clean water, as well as nourishing food, without which the life of all creatures is diminished. Life is diminished without the goods that are produced by, created by the life ground of value. Clean air, clean water, right? Food, nourishing food. Now, in this, what he calls the life economy, because life is promoted, wealth is equated with the life-giving capacity of the planet itself. That's what wealth is, not with the money sequences of the global market that are constantly maximizing private wealth for investors. So wealth is to be thought of as what promotes life coming from the earth itself, not with what makes more money, ever more money for investment. Now, indeed, he shows quite clearly that the life economy is under attack. It's under constant attack from the global market. But the life economy is sustained by what he calls the civil commons. Now, the civil commons is a set of interlocking institutions promoting not only goods like clean air, clean water, nourishing food, but also what we might call the built commons, that is publicly funded healthcare, public education, wilderness spaces, public libraries, and public broadcasting. All of them under attack from the corporate market, but sustained to some extent by the civil commons. So I've articulated 4 key concepts for climate change teacher education: growing principle of life, communities of inquiry, storytelling, and life value. Now, you might be thinking, and it would be a very good question to ask, what evidence is there that any of these concepts have any traction at all in teacher education? Well, I'm going to give you 3 examples, and it's going to be fairly quick examples, but I write about them in greater depth in the book, so you're more than welcome to ask about them. So 3 examples. The first of them from Canada. At the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program in Prince Albert, Bente Huntley, a Cree Métis professor, has used land-based education, which is another Indigenous concept, land-based education, to familiarize future teachers with an understanding of the earth as the source of all life. And she does that in a 2-day weekend camp at the beginning of each academic year. And in that camp, during that time, the future Métis teachers learn the value of diverse ecosystems, and they learn that from and with nature. So they're in nature and they're learning from nature and with nature. So that, I say a lot more about that, but I'm not going to say about it now, because I'm getting near the end of what I'm going to say. So that's the first example from Canada. In the United States, the entire campus of Oberlin College in Ohio is now net carbon negative. Net carbon negative, right? It does not produce any carbon at all. It started with one building that does not, and it spread to the whole campus. And Professor David Orr, who led this initiative, David Orr, well-known environmentalist, he promotes, quote, and I'm going to quote what he says, life as the only defensible foundation of liberal education. Life is the only foundation of liberal education, and he promotes that in the curricula of the humanities and the sciences in very interesting ways. And I think that's a process that could be readily adapted to teacher education. Why could life itself not be a defensible foundation for teacher education? So that's in the US. In the United Kingdom, for 30 years, Schumacher College has educated citizens from all walks of life in fairly non-formal forms of education about sustainability education, the importance of sustainability education, and the value of ecological diversity. And more recently, the college has introduced courses at credit in conjunction with the neighboring University of Plymouth. Right, so they've integrated both non-formal and formal education for credit, right, about sustainability education and the importance of ecological education, ecological diversity. And again, I think this is a model that could lend itself quite readily to teacher education. So those are three examples. So by way of conclusion, I think there are grounds for hope, that an awakening is taking place regarding the need for climate change teacher education. There's hope. But this process cannot delay any longer. This is urgent. It cannot delay any longer because, as Sir David Attenborough warned the United Nations in 2021, the climate crisis is, quote, the greatest threat to security that humanity has ever faced, and it is now upon us, end quote. So I'm going to end with David Attenborough.
Thank you so much, Howard. If anyone has any questions for our lovely guest tonight, I'm happy to come to you with the microphone just so everyone can hear us.
Thank you, Howard. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
And I hadn't thought about Matt Lipman and Margaret Anner and
Margaret.
Yeah, I know, sure. I hadn't thought about Harry Sotomayor's discovery. I'm sure for 15 years, which was Lipman's first book teaching philosophy in elementary school. My whole professional life just passed by my eyes in the last hour. And I was thinking about the demise of philosophy education and other related forms of inquiry. And the demise is real, and as you pointed out, it's our College of Education is just an instance of what is very widespread. But I was thinking of various pressures inside our own college that occurred and that were in part led to the demise of our subject. One is that there was resistance inside other departments inside the college. And one example would be the efforts of Irene Pelser to introduce feminist studies in that would be 1978, 79, and into 81. There was simply no understanding on the part of a great number of our colleagues about what the value of such a study could be. And one rather famous remark during the debate, you'll remember this, was because the first feminist class could not be used as the 400 level credit for that all students had to have going through the BA program. And one of our colleagues, but we were trying to move it to give it the same credit as all 400 level classes that have been created by the department, said he didn't understand why a course should get a full credit since it only dealt with 1/2 of the population. And that's virtually a quote. So there was that kind of resistance to kind of innovative thinking. It's now widely accepted, right? But that was how things started. So that's one question. A second one is that departments were little fiefdoms of their own, and we were a fiefdom. Every department wanted, like most countries, want to expand their powers, like invading Ukraine. And so when there was a few crumbs to pick up, there'd be a scramble for the few. So though I find your argument, I'm surprised if I didn't find your argument convincing, there is that world of realpolitik that has led to the departments such as Ed Foundations for being stripped. Now, those aren't so much questions as observations.
Yeah.
From my own experience.
Yes. Well, if I can, I'll just briefly say something about that. I agree with you. There is tremendous internal resistance to innovative ideas. I think this is true across the curriculum. I don't think it's peculiar to colleges of education. And you're right. I remember certain resistance to certain things we were trying to do with other courses, like our course in ethics and education. Right. But as you pointed out, with regard to feminism and education, that's actually now pretty well accepted as a not only in terms of courses that are given across Canada, but actually as a field, an important field of inquiry. So I think there is always the possibility for change, which can be broken open. And I agree there will be resistance to climate change education if it's considered to be an add-on. What I argue in the book is it's not an add-on, it's got to be integrated into every course in teacher education, whether it's foundations, administration, curriculum, arts education, science education, whatever. It should be integrated into all those. And so then it's not really a matter of one fiefdom fighting against another. It's a way in which, hey, maybe we can come together about this really significant threat to humanity and the earth.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Howard, for your optimistic comments about change. It's good to hear when talking about climate change optimism as well as about our education system. Can you comment on how Canadian faculties of education are actually doing with teaching teachers about climate change, how to teach about different ways of teaching about that? Because that seems to be the message that you're giving them. Have to do it, and if we do it, things will get better. But how are we doing it now in 2022?
Right. Well, I've seen, thank you for the question, and thank you for your comments, Tom. I've seen the efforts of teacher education in Canada to address climate change education described as sporadic and fragmented. Sporadic and fragmented. Now, having said that, there are places that actually do address climate change education in a significant manner. Lakehead University is one of them. And at Lakehead University, there are a series of courses on climate change education. Lakehead University in Northern Ontario. And there are leading people in that. But actually, one of the messages they come across with is that it's not just a question of teaching about teacher education, that is increasing knowledge about climate change. It's also very important to be able to provide solutions or possible solutions to climate change, some of which are unnecessary. They're not just technical, they involve, everyday acts that we can all engage in, but it's very important that those be learned. And I just go back to what you said about my optimism. Actually, it's not so much optimism, it's more hope. It's hope in the sense that hope is always admitting that you might fail. You might just fail. And actually, the evidence is strong that we're not doing a very, very good job in terms of climate change education. But there's always the hope that despite that, human agency, both collective and individual, can change the situation. And that's the hope that I have, because we see that particularly among young people, but we see it across among Indigenous people, we see it across the ages now. People are very concerned about climate change, and they're very concerned that this is a huge problem. The issue is we as educators could do a lot better job than we're doing.
Could you read the Letman excerpt that you referred to?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you. And actually, thank you for mentioning that, because this takes us back to Harry Stottlemyre's discovery, which was, as Don said, the first novel that Matthew Lipman wrote for children the age of 10. So let me just read you it's not too long, but I'm going to. So the first was Harry Stottlemyre's discovery for children 10 years old, in which he provided I can't even read my own book, a user-friendly, cognitive, effective environment, anyway, to try and stimulate the emotions and the reasonable discussion of young children. The fictional characters in the novel bring to life questions of interest to students who reflect upon them and reason about the issues they raise. Now, in chapter 1, and this is more specific to your question, in chapter 1, Harry has learned in school from an enlightened teacher, must be an enlightened teacher, that when sentences beginning with the word all are reversed, they are false. For example, all modern airplanes are toys. Now, if you reverse that, all toys are not model airplanes. Okay, so he's learned that in school from an enlightened teacher, presumably using communities of inquiry. Right? When he gets home, what he finds is his mother talking with her neighbor, Mrs. Olson. And Mrs. Olson suggests that another neighbor, Mrs. Bates, only talks about wanting to help the poor, which is what all those communists keep saying. Making Mrs. Bates wonder Mrs. Bates wonder if this other neighbor too is a communist. Suddenly, Harry realizes something, and he says, Mrs. Olson, just because according to you, all communists are people who want to help the poor, that doesn't mean that all people who want to help the poor are communists. Okay, right? So as is pointed out, right, what this child of 10 has learned is that, oh, and what happens is the mother, Harry's mother scolds him, saying, "Look, you've interrupted me." But he can tell that his mother is actually very proud. But what this shows is that these children of this age are able to understand logical reasoning to expose stereotypes and false assertions. Right? And it's a lovely, amusing example, right?
Do we have any other questions?
Right. No, it's Murray.
I just would like to reflect on a couple of things. Number one, when I was dean, there were 104 faculty members and 3,600 students. And that if you go to microeconomics, that gives you ability to differentiate your programs and offer things in specializations and to have small classes that end within the system. So you run a class for 300, so you can offer 8 classes of under 20 in the program. That's not there anymore. They only have 38 faculty members. The other thing, when I was dean, we had very few sessional lectures, and if there were sessional lectures, it was when somebody was on sabbatical leave for the undergraduate program. They weren't there for the graduate program. Now you've got program offerings by sessionals, not by faculty members as colleagues, but by sessionals. How you get these themes, like you're talking about specific class and ed foundations, the support for that has to run through the rest of the program. It has to be there in curriculum studies, it has to be there in development, etc., so that they get a comprehensive view. If you don't have that degree of collegiality and programmatic offering, then how do you accomplish the goals you're trying to state in your book? And this is a real issue when you're down to the numbers they have. The other thing, though, I'd like to point out, and I'm going after foundations here, you got to watch when you, what's the stage of being doing the analysis and the critique and reflection, and going quickly over to being the advocates for things and negating then the discussion. So I go into Howard Woodhouse's class and get all this shit on climate change. And if I bring up anything against climate change, then it's false logic, etc. on my part. You got to sponsor the retreat and the reflection that goes on. And if I can take my concern to go deeper than what you're saying, because you're getting into social issues. I'm concerned about science people getting up there saying science is the answer, etc. And this occurring in schools, they're not getting into the non-locality of science now, where you get into systems theory, everything. You don't look at specific events because they're contextual. There's a whole series of things that go on. The complexity of things are not being reflected in the science. And the infinite assumption that made in science, of all other things being equal, negates somebody saying science says. It's science is defined what you're doing now in your epistemology and in your system, is that's what it yields the same. This is not being coming out by teachers and critiquing in school, etc. The other thing is critical race theory. If you challenge that, then you're a bigot in society. And so now you've got the political advocacy of critical race theory going on in the College of Education, and being here in the land of the Cree and the Métis and all the rest of that crap. And so now I've got then a political position that you're espousing, that if I critique it, then I'm going against the discourse of the democracy. Now, do you have those discourses then in your foundation classes that challenge those political critiques? Because I'm really concerned about how we're politicizing the education system.
Well,
Anyway, I could go on further.
I just wanna, I agree with some of what you said about classes being too large to stimulate conversation and dialogue. Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons I replied. But let me go back to your central point. And that is, as I said very clearly, and it's made very clear throughout the book, which I encourage you to do, that,
I didn't buy it.
well, you can get it from the library, you don't have
I gotta buy it.
that respect for the opinions, the beliefs of others is absolutely fundamental to any discussion, including philosophical discussion, and it is the basis of democratic dialogue. Without that respect for people who, first of all, opposing opinions, and respect for the people who hold opposing opinions, you don't have the possibility for dialogue. You don't have the possibility for education. So you've been in one of my classes. You were in a graduate class of mine on international education. Did I force stuff down people's throat and say, if you don't believe this, then I'm not going to talk to you? I don't think so. No. Okay.
You might try.
Case, but case in point, right?
Yeah. No, but you have to have the discourse.
Absolutely. That's what this whole thing is about. That's the point of philosophy for children. The point of communities of inquiry is that you develop this capacity for reasonable discussion and respect for others who hold different views from an early age. Because if you don't do that from an early age, you're not going to have a full-fledged democracy.
And also I want adults to question what's happening so that there's critique associated with social policy.
Fine.
And so I need a theater for that.
Well, fine.
I can't resist chipping out, just saying something about the remarks that we just said. In the sense that the problem often is that you're dealing not with the real opinions of the people that are being criticized, but with a straw man that's been set up. For example, on political correctness, these are terms that the right has scored a real end run. The way they vilified, for example, critical race theory. Now, I can also say, as far as the acknowledgement that we're on Métis land and so on, I have a very good Métis friend who was a lawyer for George Erasmus for many years, works on land claims, and he really is tired of that stuff because legally it means absolutely nothing. What counts is the real relationship of forces and the real private control of monetization of property. But I wanted to say something else. In 74, and when I went to high school, teachers' college was something people who didn't want or didn't think they could go to university went to, and they get a couple of years of training and they got a teacher's license. Later, when I took a couple of degrees, always in the evening, part-time, many of those teachers were there because it now became necessary to have a bachelor's degree. We seem to be going something of a grand circle where once again, teachers' education is turning into teachers' training. And that is what we're talking about, training, no longer education. And it's always very interesting to find that if you look at the neoliberal philosophy, Hayek and the rest, their first target is always education. And to a very large degree, those succeed.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have nothing to add. There's one other question over here.
We also have one final question coming in on the live stream as somebody is typing. They are still typing. I'd rather. All right, as the wife of Howard Woodhouse, you might think that I am biased towards Howard, or I support him. I totally support him, and I recognize his
devoted work in the Department of Educational Foundations. He spent there 30 years, Howard?
Yeah.
30 years. The name Educational Foundations ring the bell to me a lot. I am originally from Czechoslovakia, and I did get my degree at University of Western Ontario here in Ontario in Canada. And my first class and first year at Western was in history and philosophy of science and medicine. It was very foundational class. I learned a lot about science and medicine, which came very well to serve me when I did my degree here at Saskatchewan in biomedical ethics. I have been teaching a lot of students here who became physicians in Saskatoon. And I can tell you, educational foundations, the philosophy is important for educating our teachers. If the course in, what was the title of the course which is not existing anymore in your department?
Well, one of them is educational thought and values.
Educational thoughts and value. That is the encompassing the philosophy of education. Am I correct? Okay, I don't know who the people are who design which are credit courses, okay? Are they professors or are they bureaucrats? I have no idea how the courses which I took personally have been marked as a credit course. If the educational philosophy is non-existent, why don't you put it as a debit course? A lot of students would take this debit course. They might take 2 debit courses and make it 1 credit course. Okay, I think it should be put back. I think it is important. Coming from the history of Czech people, when we were denied our history after 1948, I went to schools and I was told that our city of Pilsen was liberated by Russian army, whereas it was American army. Because my older sister has a picture with Black American soldier giving her chocolate. Okay, so we lived in times of lies, and I'm sick and tired when people dismiss the history and philosophy of any discipline. It could be education, it could be engineering, it could be law. Okay, so that's all that I have to say. Thank you.
We have some questions, but if you want to, you'll be good.
You answer that.
Go ahead.
We have one from the.
And here is my question, and no said that makes sense, so I will pass the mic along.
Well, thank you so much for, first of all, saying that I totally agree with this idea that in every discipline, actually, we need to have, we are memoryless. We are completely, but also thank you for such a clear idea of how education, and the market are so brutally opposed. Like we know some of the things, we intuitively have ideas, but it's a clear contraposition that I think, it's brilliant indeed. And I wanted to say that I not only think that you are talking about how important is philosophy and history and sociology and anthropology for teachers, for teachers. I think it's important for any teacher. Like we teach students in geology, biologists, paleobiologists. That's equally important. We are creating the future citizens of this earth. And the values and the critical thinking that we share with them. That's the most important. And I think, exactly as you said, we are mostly invited to teach what is, in a way, what we, in terms of economics, will be something that will be useful, or somehow we are giving these students, like a future, like in the workforce. But what we are not giving them is the most important thing. That is that conceptual what you were saying about this conceptual idea of the value of life, the value of our planet, the value of, being human beings. So I think that, what you're saying about how it's so fundamental philosophy for for people that are teaching teachers, I would say that's fundamental for every professor in a university. What kind of education are we promoting? What is our model of education? Like where are we, and of course, you're right, we are also in a context in which we have less people, in which we actually end up being training technicians, exactly as you were saying. That's what we essentially what we are hired for. Like to hire people, that are technically good at doing a particular job. Well, that's not what I think about university education. That's not my model. And I wanted to say that in my 100 level class, what I do is I put photograph from one of my favorite photographers about the Earth, and some photo from the NASA and so on. And I just try to appeal to this idea. This is our planet. This is what we are trying to understand, and trying to go also appealing to that feeling of belonging and of being part of something larger. And I really think that we are missing a lot in our education, in our university education today, in the sciences, in every area.
Right. Yes, if I can just comment on that. I agree entirely that the history of science, what I know of it, is incredibly important. And I think that science too often is taught as though suddenly, Newton's laws of motion just appeared magically like that, without taking the context of how that happened, how it was led up, like what discoveries led up to that, the life of Newton himself, which is very, very interesting. What kind of man he was, how he had to struggle, the ways in which he changed. And all of these are important. These aspects of the history of philosophy, history of science are incredibly important. And unfortunately, it's few teachers that I've seen that actually include that in science teaching. I can think of one teacher that did a master's with me, who is a physics and mathematics teacher here in Saskatoon, and he includes the history of physics, the history of mathematics as an important aspect of what he's doing, but it's all too rare. Let me just say something about why there are so few people left teaching in the College of Education. Right? I think this, and in universities in general, like how, the number of students have gone up, the number of faculty at the U of S have gone down, the number of administrators with huge salaries have gone up. They've blossomed, right? As the corporate university has taken place. Now, why has that happened? Well, one is government underfunding, right? Government underfunding. And the other is that since the early 1980s, and you can actually document this in Canada, the corporate higher education was formed so that corporate entities could actually, who understood that higher education was being underfunded by government, could fill the void in terms of research and teaching, so that research increasingly became tied to the market and the goals of the market, rather than just curiosity-based research that would serve, broader intellectual and humanistic interests. And this is reflected in the Research Council, the various Research Council of Canada that are increasingly tied to industry. Why did that happen? Why was there such radical government underfunding? Was it that there was no money available? Well, if there was no money available, how is it that private corporations and banks continue to maximize their profits? I mean, there is money available. It's just that that money is no longer being diverted into the public realm, into what McMurtry calls the civil commons, to fund public health care, public education, social services, etc. It is being used what? It is being used by finance capital to invest in financial markets that produce no goods whatsoever. We are at a point in history where the dominant way of making money in the market is not by producing goods, but by making ever more money for private speculators in what is essentially a process of gambling on foreign currency reserves and on arbitrages and such things that you and I, by and large, are unaware of. This is a process that is taking place 24/7. These financial markets around the world, and these profits are being maximized at the same time as public functions are being cut to the bone. That's exactly how the civil commons is being attacked by finance capital. So it's not a mistake that there are fewer faculty and larger classrooms and a lot more students in education or in science or in geology or in you pick any college. This is a process that's been taking place for the last 40 years or so. And some people link it with what you call neoliberalism or with what I prefer to call as the corporate global market.
Howard, can I react to that in part?
I will say that we are getting close to running out of time, so we may have room for about 5 more minutes of discussion, and then we will have to go on to the signing.
I just want to say that the book Digital Republic, how the changing in times and how the digitization of things has shifted authority and the reliance of people and has changed the whole nature of the system. And so that's what's happening now is huge in terms of a lot of things. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure that everyone has the chance to.
Just for short comment?
Sure.
Really quick.
Sure.
Thank you. It's sort of a perspective from a parent, grandparent.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, so, I'm becoming quite aware because I helped in a couple of schools before COVID, helping children at grade level with a novel study in grade 2. And that was about 6 or 7 kids that were reading at grade level, and other kids are being helped with more rudimentary things, and that's because of the makeup of the classes. And it's come, and then teachers were telling me about the stress they're under, but the stress is even more when we just go back to the underfunding, which the dean spoke to too. We've seen more sectionals also. So someone correct me on this. I need to research this, but it just keeps coming up in my brain when the current government in Saskatchewan says they have $4 billion, or maybe we'll find $4 billion for irrigation, but they have no money for education. So I'm going like, why do you want to focus on irrigation? Because you're going to, maybe there's a few farmers that will benefit from that. And even some farmers who do irrigation say the amount of money you have to put into it to even get into it, you'll hardly recoup the amount of money you're spending on it. So, you know, I think back to some of the land grabs and some of the terrible things that went on in Regina. So I'm going like, what is the real reason behind all this and what's happening with our land and the current government? Where you have lots of money for this little project out there, but you have nothing for education. And it's really stressing parents out, stressing teachers out, and now costs $100. People may or may not know this. If you have a child in schools, I think it's in public schools in Saskatoon. If you have a child that stays for school, you now have to pay $100 towards the teacher supervision or parent supervision. And I go, well, when are they going to start charging for buses next? You know, that was my comment. I wasn't going to say anything, but Howard, when you brought up about underfunding. Thank you. Thank you.
I would recommend to you a book that just came out last year, edited by Joanne Jaffe, who's at the University of Regina, called Divided Saskatchewan. And it's got some excellent articles in it about exactly what you're talking about, not only just with regard to education, but with regard to any social issue and economic issue that you care to name. Divided Saskatchewan, edited by Joanne Jaffe. It's probably here. I know it's in that other bookstore.
I believe it is here, yes, you can ask it, but
Okay.
just walk you right to it.
There I am. I end up plugging another book. Okay.
Well, let's have one more round of applause for Howard. One last thank you again to Howard and to everyone at Routledge, and thank you to everyone who attended tonight's lunch, whether that was in person or through our live stream. Howard will be sticking around to sign books at the table in the back, and of course, we have copies of the book to purchase tonight as well if you wish. You're welcome to get your copy signed before you purchase. We just ask that it is paid for at the front desk before it leaves the store. And all the excitement you can forget, just make sure you stop at the front desk. And for anyone watching at home, you can also find the book on our website. Thank you all again for joining us and have a fantastic evening.
Thank you.